What began as a quiet administrative adjustment inside the royal household's financial governance network was not initially flagged as significant, at least not in the public sense, but within internal compliance systems, the situation was already shifting beneath the surface, because in structured financial environments like this, even the smallest deviation can activate automated integrity monitoring systems. And once triggered, those systems do not wait for interpretation or approval, they escalate, they document, and they preserve every trace of activity without exception. The first confirmed anomaly originated within a restricted Dutch-linked financial ledger, where a consultant payment of £42,750 was processed under standard classification. At first glance it appeared routine, unremarkable, fully compliant with normal operational thresholds, but embedded within the system was a post-2019 governance control layer designed to detect structural inconsistencies in estate-linked transactions, and that layer immediately flagged the entry, not because of its total value, but because it exceeded a defined tolerance boundary by exactly £250. Within seconds, the transaction was removed from standard processing flow and escalated into audit-critical classification. Internal system logs confirm the escalation occurred in under 3 seconds, bypassing standard administrative review queues entirely. Former compliance personnel familiar with similar frameworks describe this mechanism as a structural tripwire, designed to activate when governance boundaries are crossed in sensitive financial zones, and once activated, it cannot be reversed at entry level. It must escalate upward through oversight channels without delay or manual suppression. 3 days later, a closed internal briefing is convened at Sandringham inside the King George V Library. No public record is issued, no external notification is made, only restricted attendance is permitted. Prince William is presented with a classified audit summary outlining structural exposure risks tied to extended trustee association frameworks. The language of the document is deliberately neutral, but its conclusion is clear: continued financial adjacency between estate governance and external familial trusteeship may compromise institutional separation standards. The meeting lasts less than 30 minutes, according to accounts from individuals briefed on the structure of the session. No objections are formally recorded. No counter-proposals are introduced, only acknowledgement of the findings and a procedural decision forming in silence. Shortly afterward, an update is executed within the Court Circular Trustee Registry system, removing 2 names from Governance Association listings without public explanation or press communication. In institutional practice, this is classified as a silent correction, not disciplinary action. But structural realignment, however, containment does not hold for long, because within 48 hours, confidential material begins circulating outside institutional control. An encrypted data package is transmitted to a national newsroom, containing structured documentation referencing trustee realignment models tied to high-value estate oversight frameworks. Early internal estimates suggest combined valuation exposure exceeding £1 billion. Verification teams initially treat the material as sensitive but unconfirmed. Yet publication processes accelerate beyond institutional coordination timelines. Once the material enters public circulation, response diverges immediately across media ecosystems. Traditional broadcasters adopt cautious framing, emphasizing verification and institutional response protocols, while digital platforms amplify the disclosure at exponential speed. Engagement metrics rise sharply within hours, and the narrative shifts from internal governance adjustment into public institutional scrutiny. At that point, response systems within the royal household transition modes, moving from communication management into structured governance integrity review procedures. Within internal response systems, the shift from communication management to structural integrity review triggers a secondary layer of monitoring. This layer does not deal with public messaging, it deals with governance exposure mapping, identifying how information moved, who accessed it, and which internal pathways allowed the anomaly to expand beyond controlled boundaries. At this stage, the issue is no longer treated as a single financial deviation, but as a potential multinode exposure event across estate-linked administrative systems. As verification teams begin reconstructing the timeline, attention shifts to cross-linked ledger activity surrounding the original transaction. Additional consultant entries are reviewed, alongside historical trustee-related financial movements. What emerges is not immediate evidence of wrongdoing, but a pattern of proximity. Transactions clustered within governance-sensitive thresholds, each individually compliant, but collectively sufficient to trigger deeper structural analysis under audit aggregation protocols designed to detect systemic exposure risk. and the mechanisms used to manage extended estate-linked financial relationships inside the royal household's legal advisory network. Escalation protocols activate under predefined compliance frameworks. These frameworks are designed not to respond to public perception, but to structural risk thresholds. Once triggered, they initiate coordinated review across legal counsel, financial audit teams, and cybersecurity integrity units, each operating independently but feeding into a unified
and comment with your forecast,
oversight assessment layer. The objective is not narrative control, but containment of systemic exposure. Parallel to this, cyber integrity monitoring systems begin flagging unusual access patterns within restricted administrative environments. Log analysis identifies repeated authentication attempts originating from internal network ranges associated with legacy administrative access points. While no immediate breach is confirmed, the pattern is sufficient to elevate monitoring sensitivity. Under internal protocol, this classification is not treated as intrusion, but as potential preparatory access behavior requiring forensic observation. As forensic review deepens, the timeline expands backward, revealing earlier system interactions that align with the initial financial anomaly. Audit teams begin mapping correlations between ledger activity and access logs, searching for overlap points where financial entries and system interactions intersect. What they find is not conclusive evidence of manipulation, but structural coincidence clusters that require explanation under governance risk assessment standards. Meanwhile, parliamentary awareness begins to surface indirectly through advisory briefings and financial transparency discussions. Select members of oversight committees receive preliminary summaries referencing estate-linked financial governance concerns. While no formal inquiry is launched at this stage, internal documentation circulation increases, signaling that the matter is transitioning from institutional review into potential legislative interest. At this point, the narrative pressure converges across three domains simultaneously: financial governance, legal oversight, and cyber integrity monitoring, each operating independently, yet now referencing the same structural dataset. And when multiple oversight systems begin analyzing the same exposure layer, escalation probability increases exponentially. Under institutional risk modeling frameworks. Within the Financial Oversight Division, attention shifts toward historical transaction frameworks tied to extended trustee associations. Compliance analysts review legacy entries dating back several years, not to identify wrongdoing, but to determine whether governance thresholds have been consistently applied across similar structures. This retrospective analysis introduces a secondary risk layer, because historical compliance gaps, even if minor, can amplify present-day exposure classifications. As this internal reassessment unfolds, external narrative momentum continues to accelerate. Financial markets begin reacting cautiously to uncertainty signals associated with reputational risk exposure. While no direct economic collapse occurs, analysts note volatility in sectors indirectly linked to reputationally sensitive estate partnerships, particularly within branding and licensing structures tied to public-facing commercial activity. Simultaneously, legal advisory teams begin preparing contingency frameworks designed for multiple outcome scenarios. These include administrative resolution pathways, compliance settlement structures, and escalation protocols for formal judicial review if required. Each pathway is mapped not as prediction, but as procedural preparedness, ensuring institutional response remains within predefined legal boundaries regardless of external developments. At the cyber integrity level, forensic imaging of affected systems is scheduled under controlled conditions. This process involves creating exact replicas of server environments to preserve evidential integrity without disrupting operational continuity. Investigators emphasize that this stage is critical because once imaging is complete, all subsequent analysis becomes legally preserved and admissible within formal investigative proceedings. As these parallel systems advance, the internal classification of the event evolves once again, no longer simply a financial anomaly, and no longer solely a governance exposure case. It now occupies a hybrid category, combining financial compliance review, cyber integrity assessment, and institutional risk evaluation under a unified investigative framework. And at this stage, containment is no longer about suppressing information, it becomes about managing convergence. As convergence intensifies across financial, legal, and cyber oversight layers, a coordinated review framework is activated under institutional governance protocol. This framework does not operate as a single investigation unit, instead it synchronizes outputs from separate domains, allowing financial auditors, legal advisors, and cyber integrity analysts to cross-reference findings in real time.
This family
The purpose is not immediate conclusion, but structural alignment of evidence streams, ensuring that no single department interprets the anomaly in isolation. Within the Cyber Integrity Division, forensic imaging of affected administrative servers begins under controlled containment conditions. Technicians create exact system replicas to preserve volatile log data, including authentication trails, access timestamps, and system-level metadata. Early analysis confirms that multiple internal access points were queried within a narrow time window, not enough to confirm an authorized intrusion, but sufficient to trigger elevated scrutiny under internal cyber risk classification rules. At the same time, financial compliance analysts continue deep ledger reconstruction, expanding their review beyond the initial transaction that triggered escalation. What emerges is a layered structure of related entries, not direct violations, but clustered financial proximity events, each individually within permissible limits, yet collectively forming a pattern that requires aggregation analysis under post-2019 governance review standards. This does not imply misconduct, but it does require formal explanation under audit transparency obligations. As internal documentation expands, legal advisory teams begin mapping potential exposure pathways, not in response to confirmed wrongdoing, but in anticipation of procedural escalation. These pathways include administrative resolution frameworks, financial remediation options, and structured compliance reporting channels designed to prevent judicial escalation where possible. However, each pathway now carries conditional triggers dependent on cyber forensic findings and audit aggregation results. Meanwhile, external media coverage continues to evolve independently of internal classification. Initial reporting focused on trusteeship adjustments, but as additional details surface, the narrative expands into broader institutional governance scrutiny. Commentators begin questioning not only the financial transaction itself, but the structural systems governing estate-linked financial oversight, and whether existing frameworks are sufficient for modern compliance expectations. Digital platforms accelerate this shift dramatically, where algorithmic amplification transforms procedural financial reporting into high-volume public discourse. Engagement metrics spike, and secondary narratives emerge, focusing on transparency, accountability, and institutional governance resilience. At this stage, perception begins to influence pressure dynamics, even though internal systems remain focused strictly on evidence-based review. Within parliamentary advice,